I suppose given the context of everything we've been seeing and everything that's been happening, even since just the time of accepting the invite to today, we've had a number of attacks across Europe, particularly in France and in Germany, and it's raised this discussion about the role of ideas and how important ideas are, and we've had this public discussion in and around how religious or not religiously observant some of the perpetrators of these atrocities were. And I think that the important point really on that sense is when you consider the average foot soldier, we tend to think of ideology and say, well, he clearly wasn't that religious, or he hadn't considered the ideology in a particularly sophisticated manner, because if you look at this individual, he hadn't been reading these books, he hadn't understood this particular idea and so on. But that misunderstands the way ideology works, I think, in the public sphere. And the example I always give, actually, is that it didn't matter that not every prison guard at Auschwitz hadn't read Mein Kampf. It didn't matter, because there's a structure, border that sits there that gives direction, meaning, purpose to these individual acts at the minutiae and at the granularity. And so in that sense, it makes the study of Salafism incredibly important. Yes, many of the foot soldiers, and particularly individuals from the West who go to Syria and Iraq or who engage in these ideas, don't have a particularly sophisticated understanding of them, of the ideas, but it's very important for us to understand it, because there are these political structures that sit at the higher level that gives purpose and meaning to some of this. And that's really what began to prompt my interest in study of Salafism over the last few years. I think in the public discourse, a lot of the language and lexicon around this is very misunderstood. So we have interchangeably the terms like Salafi and Wahhabi and Sunni and Shia and these different things that people don't fully understand. So just to start at a very basic level is to say that Salafism is a tradition, a practice of Islam that exists within Sunni Islam. It doesn't exist in the Shia strand. And really what Salafism is about, it's a philosophical idea about realizing the good Muslim life. It's how do I live the most authentic life that I can possibly lead as a Muslim. And so this comes back to a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, is one of the sources of Islamic law, the Hadith, where he was asked about, who is the best generation, who are the best Muslims, and he said the generation that's with me, his immediate companions. He said, who are the next best? The ones after them, and their children, and then their children's children. So these three generations of Islam that lived with the Prophet Muhammad, that were there in living memory of him, are collectively known as the Salafi Salih, the Salafi Salihin, the pious predecessors. And they are taken to be the markers of authenticity and purity and the best practice of Islam. That could be emulated. If you said the Prophet was, you can't emulate him because he's a perfect man, then you need to go to the Salaf around him because they were fallible, and you can try to emulate their practices. So that's what the idea is about. It's a philosophical viewpoint of living the good Muslim life of the pious predecessors. Salafism, again, in the public discourse becomes largely conflated now with terrorism because of what we see, particularly, as I say, in Syria and Iraq today. But taken as a tradition, it's a very broad tradition, and the vast majority of Salafis, if you can categorize them in a few ways, are actually quietists. They believe in education and purification. So they believe in learning more about their faith and purifying their practice of the faith. They're basically no threat to you and me. They're not really that concerned with society or with engaging with the world more generally. They're very much, as I say, concerned with themselves and saying, how do I get to paradise? How do I live the best life as a Muslim that I could lead and in order to please God? And so their concern is with themselves, their families, their communities, but they don't believe in change, and they don't really believe in radical change in particular. So that's the largest bulk. And you see state manifestations of that quietist approach in places like Saudi Arabia, but more generally around the region as well. Then you have this, what's sort of called the political category. And these are guys who are politically engaged with the system, but again, they don't really advocate radical change. They believe in working with the existing structures in order to produce and prompt political reform. So it's a very interesting category, actually, and there's in the book that talks about this as well by French academic Stéphane Ocqual, which again I would thoroughly recommend. It's very, very good. And the political Salafis engage with their government to say, look, we need reform. So you see the moment of them really coming to light after the 2011 uprisings as they go across North Africa. In countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, an individual called Salman al-Auda was very prolific in this regard, who wrote to the Saudi king, wrote to the government and said, look, we are telling people not to come out and protest. They're counseling against popular uprisings. Don't take to the public squares, don't take to the streets. This isn't a good idea. But at the same time, they're saying to the government, you have to give the people reform, and these include your human rights, an independent judiciary, all these kinds of things, and you have to do these things. If you don't do it, you can't hold back this tide forever, and the social fabric will unravel. So there's rights and responsibilities on both sides. And so they say to the people, we should campaign, we should lobby, we should do it in a peaceful manner, and to the government deal with it. So they're an interesting category. As I say, they still predominantly believe in working with the structure and going for evolution rather than a revolution. And then you have the final category, which is the jihadist strain, which of course is rejectionist. It opposes domestic structures of the state, opposes all internationalist structures as well, and it seeks a radical millenarian upheaval of really everything around it. And so this is the smallest of those three sections. You could say it's been dramatically empowered more recently as a result of what's happened in the Levant, and has been able to attract people, perhaps grow its numbers as a result of what's happening in the Levant today. Again, because of the apparent or supposed success that it's had in carving out a parcel of land for itself in Syria and Iraq, and by giving itself this title of statehood, of the caliphate. Again, as I say, for the purposes of certainly attracting people, it's been very successful in that way. So it's that last section that I've sort of gone into looking at, what the book looks at, and I sort of look at tensions within the different Salafi groups, the intra-Salafi debate, again for authenticity between the quietists and the jihadis, or between the politicos and the jihadis. But fundamentally, it's about the jihadis. And what I'm doing with these jihadis is to essentially say, what are the sort of 5 defining characteristics of this movement, or the 5 most important ideas, which I'll come to in a moment. But essentially, take those ideas and say, these ideas all exist within normative Islam. I'm not saying there's something that they've cooked up that's brand new. But what is interesting, and what I attempt to do, is say, what have they done that's different in their interpretation or understanding of these ideas that differentiates it from normative views, from normative understandings. So there's 5 ideas, and I'll come to them one by one. Is jihad, clearly, it's very, one of the defining features of the movement. Takfir, the process of excommunication, again, very important for the movement. Al-Wala wal-Bara, which is again perhaps the most interesting of all the concepts. It really means sort of love and hate, or loyalty and disavow for the sake of God, and it's a process of sort of essentially you're with us or against us. Is a good way to think about it. Then Tawheed, which is really the concept of monotheism within Islam, and Hakimiyya, the idea of Islamic governance. So these are the 5 ideas. As I say, especially with Tawheed, I played with this idea: should I include it or should I not? Because again, all Muslims believe in Tawheed. You can't. It's the single most important factor of Islam. You put Islam into one word, it's Tawheed. So to put it in a book like this, I had to be very clear in saying it's about how the jihadis have understood this idea. I'm not saying this idea is a jihadist concept. It is how they have come to it. I'll come to that in a second. So the point with jihad is that they've made jihad into this the pinnacle of Islam. They say it's the highest form of duty and obligation, and of course they say it's an act of worship, which is very important. So they say it's like any ritualistic act. So you're obliged to pray and to fast and to give charity, but jihad is also your obligation. It becomes like the ordinary ritualistic action, and you must engage in it and fight in it, and so on. And clearly for them, the process of fighting is the realization and the means to give Islam power and legitimacy in the physical realm, because they feel it can't be empowered without it. Takfir, as I say, is a process of excommunication, and really its function and the way it operates within Islam is to, I suppose, keep the faith pure, I suppose, right? So it guards it against insidious sort of weakening from within, because if someone tries to reform it, or someone tries to interpret ideas in a particular way, you can say this person has become an apostate, he's left, and it's that process of pushing them out in order to keep your own rigidity within the practice. And again, particularly for Salafi jihadis, it's used to keep their sort of, I suppose, ideological purity guarding against any sort of weakening of the rules, because they will pronounce takfir on people. But it's also used very dramatically, of course, to license the sectarian conflicts against the Shia, in particular, in the region. And now you see it increasingly against Alawis and so on. But it's principally been used as a tool to persecute the Shia and to fight the Shia, specifically in Iraq as a result of 2003, and now again increasingly in Syria as well. So it's a very important point, and really when Zarqawi led Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, he really developed takfir in a very important direction to give it primacy to fighting the Shia, even over to fighting the Western coalition that had invaded at the time. It was the Shia who were prioritized and regarded as problematic. Wala wal bara, as I said, is this concept of love and hate, loyalty and disavow. And as I say, it's this idea of you're with us or you're against us. And it's a really interesting concept because when it first emerged, it emerged in a very ritualistic sort of way to the early Muslims about distinguishing themselves from the Quraysh, from the non-Muslim sort of Meccan tribes by sort of being physically different, so having beards, or having different festivals, having Eid and these sorts of things. It was about distinction of ritual, and then it becomes politicized actually in the 19th century, so very late on in the day, as the sort of first and second Saudi states rose and fell before the creation of the third Saudi state, which is the one that has endured. But it was sort of starting to give political resonance and meaning at that time to try and tell other warring tribes against Al Saud, for example, to say, look, don't fight us, right? Work with us, have your loyalty to us and your disavow from these other warring tribes. So it takes on a more political dimension at that moment. And what's interesting is that Al-Qaeda really in the post 9/11 climate becomes the sort of first real group to try and demand loyalty on the basis of wala wal bara. So it's not even a state anymore that's claiming it's owed loyalty under this maxim. It's now a group and non-state actors saying we are owed your loyalty and allegiance under this doctrine. So it's an interesting manner in which they developed it. And in fact, just last night, Ayman and I were looking at you may have seen this interview with a guy called Jihadi Jack, an English convert from Oxfordshire who's gone out to fight Syria and Iraq. He wrote a Facebook post in Arabic where he was essentially saying, I disavow my parents because they don't believe in Islam and this kind of thing. So it's an interesting, I think it's even at that level how it's playing out and so on. With Tawheed, as I say, it's this sort of overarching idea all Muslims believe in. It's not a controversial idea at all. But what the jihadists have done is they say, look, there are certain ways that you have to try and realize the full meaning of Tawheed and all of its complexities. How do you demonstrate your devotion and to God, your belief in God in all these different ways? So you have your ritualistic obligations and demands. Yes, you fast because God commanded you to do it. You pray because God commanded you to do it. You give charity. These are all different ways of realizing the different facets of God. But Muslims also believe that when God started the process of creation and stuff, he listed down everything that would happen, and one of the things that's fixed for a soul is the point at which it will die. So you can't move that, right? So this is a point that is in Islamic scripture. You can't do anything to move your death forward or backwards. The time is fixed. So for the jihadist movement, they say, how can you demonstrate your belief in this concept? How can you show God you believe in this concept? Well, if you really believe in it, you would come to Syria today, or Iraq, or to the battlefields of Afghanistan in the 1980s, or whatever it is, and fight, because you're just as likely to die next week in London on your way to work, if that was your moment, as if you were here in the battlefield. So coming here won't increase the harm to you, it won't increase the risk to you, it won't shorten your lifespan. And if you really believe in that, if you really want to demonstrate that, then you have to imperil yourself by fighting jihad. So it's a really remarkable point, because they basically said anyone who doesn't fight jihad can't realize Tawheed in its full conception, and can't realize Tawheed in the way it's really supposed to be realized. And then the final point is of Hakimiyya, is a point of governance and having an Islamic state. And again, of course, different theorists and different movements and groups have envisaged and theorized the notion of Islamic statehood in all kinds of different ways. And what's the most interesting about this idea is I found 2 points that were interesting. One is that the contemporary jihadist movement actually writes least about this. And I think the reason it does that is because partly you need to justify an idea like takfir, explain to the broader Muslim world why you're bombing a Shia shrine in southern Iraq, or why you've blown up a Sufi shrine in Syria, or whatever. You need to convey this and try to convince people of your idea, and these ideas are not well established. But with Hakimiyya, you've had a long run at the notion, right, starting from a century ago with Muslim revivalists and theorists started to talk about this idea. So the idea sort of exists, and because it's so broad, people kind of loosely buy into it in different ways, from sort of, you could say, the more sort of liberal Islamist end, for want of a better term, right up to people who conceive of it in the ISIS kind of fashion. So they don't feel the need to convey the idea, I think, quite so strongly. It's already had a degree of popular purchase and establishment at intellectual level in the region. The only other point is, and which makes it different, is that whereas the genesis of the contemporary understanding of all these ideas, jihad, takfir, and so on, exists in the Levant, or the Arab world more generally, the Levant and Gulf, and slightly North Africa, and it comes out of the political experiences in those countries. So it's come out of responses to events in those countries. The real genesis with Hakimiyya comes out of the Indian subcontinent, when the Indian free India movement was gathering momentum, in which Muslims played a large role. And Maududi in particular begins to really theorize about having a form of Islamic governance, and then his ideas are transposed back into the Arab world by people around him. Maududi didn't write Arabic, but some of his colleagues did. They translated his books, and who was reading those books? Sayyid Qutb. And so you see Maududi's influence on Qutb and the sort of translation of those ideas and going from the Indian subcontinent and the particular environment at that time back into the Arab world, and then being popularized within the Arab context. So that makes it a slightly different idea, which is interesting because it comes out of different geographical location and culture and sort of different practice of Islam before being brought back. My contention is that Salafi Jihadism is really a very modern phenomenon. It's come together and coalesced as something we recognize as Salafi Jihadism in the form that we would see it as in today, really even as a result of the 2003 Iraq War. I don't even think it was fully formed, as it were, in 2001. But it was 2003 where it really began to take on a life of its own. It really began to have more of a debate around some of these ideas, and to try and produce a lot of literature that theorized it in order to convince firstly the Arab world, but more generally the Muslim world, about what was happening. So if war is the driver and the catalyst of all of this, and we've seen it more increasingly with the recent conflicts, where does that leave us today? Well, Syria and Iraq are clearly the most important crucibles of the jihadist impulse today. They're the most defining characteristics of the region and in which Salafism operates. What's become very clear to me is that ISIS does not produce large theological tracts. It doesn't produce interesting theological works. It doesn't have a deep theological output. You can see, and I'm going to stop on this point, you can see the start of interesting theological, ideological changes, a slightly more pragmatic approach, in my opinion, from Al-Qaeda in Syria. If you look at the areas that it governs in Idlib province, you see a lot of discussion about the suspension of the hudud. These are specific punishments that are mentioned within the Quran, such as chopping the hand of thief, stoning the adulterer, these sorts of things, which they've suspended. And they've basically created a bit of theological pragmatism to justify suspending it. And that's very interesting, because you would never have seen that kind of approach from Al-Qaeda in 2003. So it's on a journey of sorts. Now, I'm not saying they're doing this because they're moderating. In fact, quite the opposite. I think they're doing this from a pragmatic point of view, which is to win public opinion. They've really begun to understand the need to carry public opinion for their agenda and their cause. And of course, it allows them to message to the Arab world and to the Muslim world in particular, to say, we always told you we want extremists. If you want to see what extremism is, look at ISIS. So you are seeing the start of this new process from Al-Qaeda in Syria, and I think we'll see that intensify over time, but it remains to be seen quite how that goes and where it leads. I'd say it's very early. But it is interesting for people like us who watch jihadi theology to see where this will lead, and I'll happily stop there.